Only an hour or two after falling asleep, the thunderous bang of the door crashing in tore him from his precious rest. Footsteps pounded hard enough to make the bed springs creak, dragging Akira up out of slumber. In his half-asleep state, he couldn't process what was happening. This was Akira's apartment, a tiny room in a run-down building. Empty but for a bed, a refrigerator, and a small lamp. The floor and the walls were bleak concrete. To Akira, who needed little more than a place to eat, sleep, and shelter from the rain, it was the perfect room, comfortable and empty of meaning. Who had shattered his peace and quiet? Probably someone he'd beaten. Looking for revenge, it wouldn't be the first time. Too lethargic to rise, he remained sprawled in bed even as he sensed them coming up beside him.
Oi, Akira!
A split second later, someone seized the front of his hair and yanked his head off the pillow. Two men in black uniforms. They weren't from Blaster. The one gripping Akira by the hair looked high-strung, with slick back hair and a thin face. The one standing behind him was well-built. Both were wearing white gloves and had clubs strapped to their waists. Cops. Seeing Akira's glare, the thin-faced officer let out a snort of laughter.
生意気な目だな。なんか文句でもあんのか。
Without letting go of Akira's hair, the man punched him hard in the face.
一緒に来てもらうぞ。
なんでだよ。
He had no idea.
お前に殺人の容疑がかかってる。
何？
Murder. He looked at the well-built officer.
他の誰かと間違えてるんじゃないのか。
Though the post-war chaos had at last begun to calm down, the system was still full of holes. False arrests were hardly unusual.
なんだと？
The thin-faced officer's temple twitched.
話せよ。
He tried to shake free, but the man only gripped tighter.
まったく。最近の若い連中は礼儀の一つもなってなくて困るよ。本当にバカばっかりだ。そんな口を一般人が警察に聞いていいと思ってんのか。
Narrow eyebrows rising, the thin-faced policeman contorted his lips in a sneer.
白を切っても無駄だぞ。抵抗しても罪がかさむだけだ。ロストってお前のことだろ。ガキの喧嘩じゃ飽き足らず、とうとう殺しまでやっちまったが、しょうがないやつだな。
If they knew his alias, it meant they also knew his reputation on the streets. He doubted they had a positive image of Blaster. Knowing he was the champion, they probably thought he was some kind of psycho.
ガキがたかだかストリートファイトで有名になったぐらいでいい気になるなよ。
俺じゃない。
Akira snapped. His voice low, the thin-faced officer grabbed him hard by the jaw and jerked their faces together. His eyes were full of contempt.
言い訳ならいくらでも気が済むまで書で聞いてやるからな。
With that, he released Akira's hair and stepped away. Immediately, the well-built police officer seized both of Akira's arms, then dragged him out of bed and pinned his hands behind him.
話せよ。
黙れ！
As Akira attempted to shake him off, the thin-faced officer clapped him in the back. It was a merciless blow, knocking the breath from his lungs.
ほら、キリキリ歩けよ。
Grinning, the thin-faced officer leaned forward and tapped Akira on the side of the face with the end of his club. The officer behind him hauled him to his feet, then marched him through the front door. Even more than the false accusation, it was their attitude that infuriated him. They probably hadn't performed a real investigation. He didn't normally give a damn how this country was run, but that didn't mean he was about to let these cops walk all over him.
あれ、ちょっと。
As soon as Akira was through the door, he heard a familiar voice. Turning, he saw a friendly face, eyes, and mouth agape. It was Keisuke, frozen in a place with his hand stretched toward the doorknob. His coveralls were so stained with black that it was hard to make out the original color.
どけ、邪魔だ。
The tin-faced policeman shoved him aside with his club.
おい、ちょっと待てよ。
Coming back to himself as he staggered, Keisuke laid a frantic hand on the shoulder of the officer restraining Akira. The officer flung him back with so much force. Keisuke staggered again. For a second, he looked shocked, but then his anger flared.
待てって言ってんだろ。アキラが何したんだよ。
うるさい！お前も公務執行妨害で逮捕するぞ。やろう！
Keisuke dove at them, but the well-built officer shouldered him away.
Akira!
The power of the blow was too much. Keisuke collapsed with a groan.
おら歩け
Akira looked over his shoulder as they dragged him along. Keisuke was watching him, face screwed up in pain. Even after the officers forced him to face forward again, Akira could sense Keisuke's eyes staring helplessly at his back. The cheap, rusted steel desk rattled beneath the detective's hand. In the light of the desk lamp, his face looked like a well-carved totem pole. His skull was so fierce that his eyes seemed about to pop out over their sockets.
いい加減白状したらどうなんだ?
He had been repeating the same phrases in his aging below for quite some time now. Akira leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He wondered if the man would ever get bored.
人の話聞いてんのかこのコンコンチキが!
警部、血圧上がりますから落ち着いて。
The timid-looking detective, taking notes nearby, made a tentative effort to calm the older man down. His gaunt features and pale complexion made him look like a walking corpse.
そうだな。少し落ち着こう。君、カツ丼でも食うか?
The detective asked Akira in a somewhat more restrained tone of voice, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a wrinkled handkerchief. Akira didn't reply, of course. From the beginning, he hadn't responded to any of their questions. Ultimately, he was here as a material witness, since they hadn't pinned him down definitively as the perpetrator. But that didn't change the fact that this interview was meant to extract a confession, and there was no way he was going to confess to something he hadn't done. The inspector's face flushed red, contorting more and more as the silence continued. Eventually, he began quivering, all but letting out a snarl before losing his patience for the umpteenth time.
ねえ、カツ丼どころじゃないわ! いいから白状しろ! しろ!
警部。
それをよこせ!
The inspector snatched the documents from the timid detective and licked his fingers. Then flipped through the pages. He raised his eyebrows.
国民番号 11298TM3099 無職家族構成は父母のみ3年同居の後に別居ブラスター個人戦優勝経験あり別居ね鬼ババだったとかならともかく優しくていいご夫婦だったそうじゃないか
The distant memory of his foster parents surfaced in the back of his mind. They had indeed been kind. He considered himself lucky. But in the end, they were just strangers. They shared no ties of blood. The detective leaned forward, nose almost touching the papers, and glared up at Akira.
犯行推定時刻は午前3時頃。害者の死因は全身打撲による外傷性ショック死。アリバイなし。現場から半径200メートル以内にいた。しかもブラスターの常連ときたら
The inspector slammed the papers down on the desk.
お前がに考えられたろうが
How did being a blaster fighter ultimately make him the culprit? He could understand them having a bad impression of him, but that didn't give them the right to label him a criminal.
やってない。
嘘つけ！お前がやった！そうだな！
When Akira stared back sullenly, the detective sucked in a sharp breath and pointed at him.
瞬きをした。今お前は瞬きをしたな。黙っていても目は口ほどに物を言う。はい、私がやりました。と。
Akira was beginning to care less and less about where this was headed. If the state was this determined to pin the crime on him, there wasn't much he could do.
とにかく返すわけにはいかん。おい、連れてき。
The inspector spat the words with a reddened face. He slammed the steel desk again hard enough to leave a dent. Taking that as their cue, two policemen entered and took Akira's arms. They were the same officers who had arrested him earlier.
さて、快適なお部屋へご案内だ。お前が住んでたボロい犬小屋より居心地はマシだろうよ。
The tin-faced officer sneered, his voice slimy in Akira's ear. Spurred by revulsion, Akira spat at his cheek. His entire face twitching with rage. The officer wiped his cheek with the back of his hand. Akira laughed scornfully.
だったらあんたが入ればいいだろ
う。この狂犬が！
The second they yanked him out of the interrogation room, the well-built officer pulled Akira's arms together behind him. The other officer unhooked his club. Akira braced himself for what was coming.
ほら、さっきの勢いはどうした？
The dull thwack of his club echoed down the dimly lit corridor. Grimacing, Akira squeezed his eyes shut and endured it without making a sound. If he let so much as a single groan, he'd be giving them exactly what they wanted.
泣けよ！泣きわめけよ！
Harder blows rained down on him as they hurled him back against the wall. He caught a glimpse of the tin-faced officer grinning, his eyes wide with sadistic joy. Who was the mad dog here, exactly? This whole country was rotten beyond redemption. Who was anyone supposed to believe in a brighter future? They were long past the point of no return. The beating continued, but the more it hurt, the more determined Akira became to give these scumbags nothing. How much time has passed since they put him in the cell? They beat him from head to toe. A dull ache filled every inch of his body. Without a doubt, this jail was the whitest building Akira had ever seen. Everything was white, from the walls and the ceiling to the floors and bed sheets. Strangely, it made the place seem dim and eerie, even though the facility was lit by so many fluorescent lights that he could barely open his eyes. Occasionally, he heard freakish moans or off-key humming in the distance. If anything, it felt more like a hospital psych ward than a place to house criminals. And in fact, that was precisely what it was. Several years ago, due to a rise in crimes related to mental illness, juvenile crimes foremost among them, the government decided that all criminal behavior was indicative of an underlying psychological pathology. Those prisons became institutions providing psychiatric treatment. The government went to great lengths to overturn existing perceptions of prison, such as by implementing strict sanitation standards and using white interiors to emphasize sterility. But what lay within was no less hellish than before. As ever, the government only cared about outward appearances. It felt so pristine here, it made him shudder. Akira's bed was soaked with the powerful scent of disinfectants, more than enough to give him a headache. Somewhere out there, he could hear a man with a deep voice calling for his mother. Perhaps the merciless whiteness of his room was making him hallucinate. As Akira gazed at his equally white walls, the man's voice called up a memory. "You're not my real mom." Akira had been walking down a residential street when a child had burst from a nearby house, screaming at the top of his lungs. A woman, probably his mother, had shouted after the child, but he'd run off without sparing her a glance. Akira had only caught a short glimpse, but that had been enough to see the bruises and scars covering the child's body. In the end, strangers were strangers. While it might have been different in another era, right now everything was hopelessly worn out. No one could afford to love someone who wasn't truly related to them. When you got down to it, the only person you could trust was yourself. The ponderous sound of a door sliding open cut through the din. Akira pulled himself out of his reverie. He could see a guard swaggering down the hallway. Halting in front of Akira's cell, he briefly looked inside with a scowl, then undid the lock and slid the bars open. Clearly, he'd rather be anywhere else.
出ろ、面会だ。
面会？
He couldn't think of anyone who'd come looking for him here. As he considered this, the guard impatiently jerked his chin toward the hall. Though it still didn't make any sense to him, Akira slowly forced his sore body to stand. The pure white room into which Akira was ushered resembled a bleached version of his cell. If they shut him up in a place like this, he was confident that he'd go crazy in a matter of hours. The room was divided down the middle by a thin sheet of glass, with chairs set up on either side.
面会時間は10分だ。
The guard's forbidding voice echoed off the walls. Akira's mysterious visitors were already waiting on the opposite side of the glass. A woman, seated, with a man standing at her side. He'd never seen either one before. At first glance, they almost didn't seem real. Everything about them was too neat, too tidy. It was like looking at a pair of life-size dolls. As Akira took his seat, the woman's narrow lips widened in a smile. Her skin was as white as wax.
国民番号 11298 TM3099 だな。
Akira had never gotten used to the lifeless numbers the government had assigned him. He stared at the woman in silence. Meeting his eyes steadily, she opened her mouth again.
単刀直入に言おう。我々がここに来たのは他でもない。お前の殺人罪についてだ。
俺じゃない。
Her smile deepened.
お前の容疑が晴れる可能性はほぼゼロに等しい。
Who on earth were these two? Obviously, they weren't ordinary civilians, and considering the way they carried themselves.
自己紹介が遅れたな。私はエマ。彼はグエンだ。まあ、公にはできない立場のものとでも思ってもらえればいい。
Well, whatever that meant, it was clear that they were here on his behalf.
話を戻そう。今言った通り、お前の容疑が晴れる可能性はほとんどない。殺人罪を犯した者の末路は知っているな。
Her tone was suggestive. Prodding, she was testing him. His annoyance building, Akira replied.
終身刑だろ。
そうだ。当然、その恐ろしさも知っているな。
A life sentence. Under the new laws of this country, all murderers, regardless of circumstance, receive life in prison. But what that really meant was torture, state sanctioned, that lasted until your death. Prisoners were prevented from killing themselves, and were tormented in ways designed to ensure that they lasted as long as possible. At times, murderers who killed people in particularly heinous ways were forced to undergo the exact same treatment they themselves had inflicted. It was all to bring the rising rate of violent crime under control, or so the government claimed.
このままだと、お前は確実に終身刑となる。
俺じゃない。
Akira glared at Emma, his words imbued with anger. More than he feared death or punishment, he was infuriated by this outrageous treatment. Emma lifted her chin, a gesture of contempt.
いくらここで無実を主張したところで、法廷で裁かれれば終わりだ。聞け。何もわざわざお前に最後通告をしに来たわけではない。要件はここからだ。
Emma's eyes held a challenging light.
解放してやれなくもない。ただし、こちらが提示する条件を飲めばな。
条件？
国民番号 11298TM3099 ブラスター個人戦優勝者、敗戦記録はなし。腕は確かなようだな。
どいつもこいつもよっぽどブラスターが好きなんだな。
He was starting to get sick of hearing about it. Emma laughed a little at his response.
豊島という町のことは知っているな。
The sudden change in topic took Akira by surprise. Toshima, a district of the Old Lands, the abandoned capital metropolis where criminals gathered to flee the spreading tendrils of reconstruction. The city's existence caused no end of trouble for both the CFC and Nikuren, but neither side was willing to let the other solve the problem. A true solution was likely impossible as long as the country remained divided.
知っているという顔だな。それならイグラの噂ぐらいは聞いたことがあるだろう。ブラスターに参加しているのならなおさらな。
イグラか。
He'd heard the rumors. Igura was an underground fighting tournament held in the lawless Kashima district. There were more than a few blaster participants who longed to enter Igura.
同じストリートファイトとはいえ、イグラはブラスターのようなお遊びではない。命をかけた真剣勝負だ。勝ち残った者はイルレの座を手に入れ、名実ともにトシマの王として君臨する。
イルレ？
トシマを拠点とする麻薬組織ヴィスキオの首領のことだ。連中はそう呼んでいる。イグラとはイルレの座をかけた争奪戦のことだ。最も強い者こそがヴィスキオを率いるにふさわしいと、あの町に群れる狂犬どもは本気でそう思っている。血みどろの殺し合いが日々平然と行われている。というわけだ。
ただの噂じゃなかったのか。
Street gangs were wanting the leader of the organization like Fischio who need brains, not just brawn. It was as plain as the nose on Akira's face that choosing their leader by straying alone would eventually lead to their downfall.
それが本当なら、ビスキオは正真正銘のバカの群れだな。
だが、ビスキオは我々 CFC や日光連も無視できない巨大なシンジケートとして勢力を誇っている。それがなぜか、わかるか？頂点に立つ者が不動だからだ。イグラが始まってから今日に至るまで、現役のイルレを破って新たな王座を手に入れた者はいない。一人もな。
一人も？
イグラの開催者である初代のイルレが、今も腐敗の王としてビスキオに君臨しているということだ。裏を返せば、奴は腐敗の自信があるからこそ、王座争奪戦などという酔狂なゲームを始めたのだろうな。
Without realizing it, Akira's image of the man called Ilray had become a presence in his mind too great to ignore. The tournament's founder, an undefeated champion, who willingly risked his life and position to lay low all the brave souls who faced him. No one will doubt the strength of a man like that.
現役のイルレは最強というカリスマ性によって組織を一つにまとめている。奴の腐敗伝説が崩れれば、組織も崩壊せざるを得ないだろう。それが。
Emma posed to give Akira an icy glare.
我々の望むところでもある。
Akira had begun to connect the dots.
要するに、イルレを打ち負かしてしまうような挑戦者を探している。そういうことか。
その通りだ。例えば、ブラスターで連続優勝を飾るほどのストリートファイトの熟練者などは、実に有望株だろうな。
It was obvious by now what condition he will need to meet in order to get his murder charge dropped. This icy-eyed woman wanted him to enter Igura to join the festival of the slaughter and fight his way to the top.
あんたたち、国か警察かそっち側の人間だろ？いいのか？未来を担う若者を殺し合いに駆り立てて。
In response, Emma laughed scornfully.
無期懲役囚が担う未来などない。それに、お前の知る意味での警察とも我々は違う。我々は治安を維持するのではなく、治安の障害を排除する役目を負った人間だ。
Indeed, the detectives who'd question Akira had an entirely different aura than the two currently in front of him. These two they looked like the sort of who treated people's life as if they were numbers on a balance sheet.
これまでにも数回にわたってビスキオに侵入しイルレを暗殺する作戦が実行されたが、そのすべてが失敗に終わっている。イルレの守りは鉄壁だ。奴に近づくどころか正体をつかむことさえ叶わなかった。奴はイグラの決勝戦でしか姿を現さない。奴と接触し仕留める機会があるとすれば、そこしかない。
また随分必死だな。
豊島から CFC に流出している麻薬の量を知っているか？ビスキオは我々にとって目に余るほど大きな海だ。
So, they saw themselves as serving the greater good, all without getting their own hands dirty.
俺がイルレを倒したとして、もし新しいイルレが現れたら